Hi, thank you for dropping into this video presentation. My name is Analeigh Horton, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a PhD student, teacher, and researcher at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And I'm super excited to be sharing my research interests through the presentation today, literacy, UX, and Digication through the lens of L2 writers in an L1 world. Before we get into the presentation, I just want to acknowledge that the research, education, and the land on which I'm giving this presentation today was all violently seized by the United States government from the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaqui tribe, who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. If you'd like to follow along with the slides today, or just be able to reference them later in the future, this is a tiny URL that you can use. It is L2DL, the name of the conference, 2020-Horton, that's me. So before we get too into the research today, I just want to provide some grounding terms, as these are words that are taken up in different ways in different spaces, or just maybe things that you've not heard of before. So the first is sociocultural literacy. And although historically literacy has been defined within terms of reading and writing, through a sociocultural lens, we can understand it as being much more capacious and a literate identity involving things like language and culture and circumstances, all working together to inform an individual's sense of literacy. UX stands for user experience, and it's kind of self-explanatory. It's the experience that a user has when they are using a technology. Digication is one such technology that we'll be looking at today. It's an online eportfolio tool designed specifically for students. And then multilingual composition is a rose that by other names perhaps sells as sweet. You may have heard it called L2 writing or SLW, second language writing. But I use the term multilingual composition first to offer more agency to users of multiple languages, and then composition to be a little bit more expansive than just writing alone and include things like digital design practices and literacy, which we'll be looking at today. So a brief background on the modern US writing classroom is that it's a very diverse place. There are lots of different students with lots of different cultures and languages and literate identities that all enter into a writing classroom. In the 80s, you can see the citations that I listed from Zemel and Silva. There was a lot of conversation about separating students that had multiple language capabilities from those that were not, that were more monolingual. And that conversation is still alive and well today. A product that has come out of it is, if you look at a writing program's curriculum, there's usually a section that writing scholars may refer to as mainstream. And in that section, it's usually people who are from the United States. English is the first and generally only language that they routinely use. And just with the landscape of the United States, a lot of times that is a very white space. Whereas in other sections of the same course that has the same student learning outcomes, the difference is that this section of the course is designed specifically for international and multilingual students. And sometimes you'll see smaller course caps, additional support and emphasis on that multilingual and international identity. And a lot of times the instructors of those courses have specific training in working with that population. So those are the two types of classes that we'll see in a typical foundational writing course in the United States today. But in spite of these courses, there is the occurrence that even though a student might fit nicely into that multilingual international section, for whatever reason, they end up in the mainstream course. And so while it's such an important conversation to continue about developing supports for these students, I would argue that relegating them only to that class is no longer a debate that is productive, because we're finding multilingual, international, multicultural students across all of our sections of writing. And a common space that a lot of these students are meeting and interacting with each other are digital spaces. And especially now with so much digital and online learning because of the coronavirus, we need to figure out what digital spaces as teachers are we providing for students. How do we support them in those digital spaces? And in order to answer those pedagogical questions, I want to do a little bit of backwards design through the case study that I'm going to present today that looks at this third question of how do 21st century L2 writers engage in digital spaces? So I'm going to present a case study of 3 multilingual writers who were in the, quote, mainstream section of Foundations Writing in the University of Arizona's writing program. It was the second semester of a 2-sequence course that focused specifically on rhetoric and research. Digication, I mentioned it a minute ago as an eportfolio tool. I just wanted to give you the template, the bare bones that I created in just a couple of minutes for the class to say, hey, this is, your canvas. Please paint it as you will. And so you see that it's a template. You see the large pane of design options. This is just one of many. And in a minute, you'll see how students use those in various ways to create really diverse portfolios. And then at the bottom, there's a commenting feature. And collaborative writing practices were really important to the students in this research today. So that's one way that they were able to engage in those practices. The first student I want to introduce you to today is Amira. And for all 3 students, I provided 2 quotes from an introductory letter that they wrote at the beginning of the semester to me. One quote is focused a little bit more on cultural identity, and the other is a bit more focused on language and writing. But to summarize the quotes that are on your screen, Amira was a refugee from Syria, and 10 years ago she had to flee from Syria to Jordan, and after 4 years in Jordan she moved to the United States and has been in Tucson for the past 3 years. And of the 3 students we're looking at today, she considerably had the lowest proficiency in terms of speaking and listening and reading and writing, but she had an extreme sense of motivation to not let those things impede her learning and to really develop her language skills and her writing skills and her overall communicative competence. And Amira's research was focused on public and community health. The next student is Min, and he is an international student who is very proud of his international identity from Vietnam. He completed his junior and senior year of high school in the United States, and so he felt relatively competent in the US culture and using English, but when it came to writing, he was pretty ambivalent to the practice. He knew that he would have to do it, but didn't particularly enjoy doing it. He did, however, really enjoy his research interest of international business. Jamila is an international student who was born and raised in Saudi Arabia, but her family was from Ethiopia, and so she had a very strong bicultural identity of being Ethiopian and Saudi Arabian, and she wanted to add to that a third culture, which was her inspiration for coming to the US for college. She really prided herself upon her trilingual capabilities between English, Amharic, and Arabic, but in spite of this language proficiency, she was noticing that there was a considerable difference between high school level writing and college writing, and that was something that she struggled with throughout her experience in the Foundations Writing program. Jamila's research interest was in sustainable industry. So I'm going to go through a couple of the literate practices, digital practices that these students all had in common in Digication. And the first is design practices. So for Amira, she had very little experience with using digital technologies beforehand. You can see her first project, and it's exclusively alphabetic text. There's 2 hyperlinks, but they're not named. They're just kind of dropped in there. But by her second project, she had learned how to embed the videos, blend different modes of communicating information. By her third project, she was using PowerPoints, which was a big move from her original Word documents that she was dropping into her website. And she was integrating this technology and using it to demonstrate how different colors and textual features could be more rhetorically effective for her purpose. And she eventually was able to make an infographic. And you can see from the first picture that I showed you to this one, the design capabilities and using this digital technology grew so much. So Amira specifically made the most progress in her ability to design digitally. Jamila was very committed to her sense of professionalism. She believed that as a business major, she would only ever be writing business reports, and what those looked like for her were the image that you can see on the screen. Black and white text, nothing else, everything is formatted the exact same way. You can see in the top, she didn't even change the word template. Very, very little design went into this. But by the third project, after many conversations about genre awareness, Jamila realized that she can still maintain the sense of professionalism and communicate the business matters that she was interested in through different genres and be just as, if not more, rhetorically effective. And so you can see the PowerPoint presentation that she designed in the third project. And she reflected upon this to explain that there was a real tension in her believing me that she could be effective in different modes, and it was a difficult transition to go from strictly alphabetic text to a more visual genre. But in the end, she did realize that it was more rhetorically effective, and she felt like she made the right choice making that switch. Min of the three had the most confidence in design. The picture in the top is his first project. So compared to the first project of the other two students, you can see that it's considerably more designed with a custom background, a mix of PDF and Word documents, there's an image, there's a video embedded. So he felt very confident in his ability to design different kinds of documents, and he wanted to continue that confidence by becoming proficient in other kinds of technologies and design practices. So he used the course to experiment. Another thing that the students were learning in addition to digital design was their content knowledge of rhetoric and writing. And for Amira, she was really focused on improving her English proficiency, but one thing that she realized was there was a difference between general communicative competence in English and the language practices of the health professional discourse community that she would need to enter into if she wanted to become a public and community health expert. And so Amira was constantly balancing this language, this learning of just English, and then layering on top of that some really tricky health terms that she had never really come into contact with before in English, but knew that she would need to adopt to enter into that discourse community. For Jamila, she was constantly reflecting on the struggles that she faced, and there were some successes within that, but one of the main struggles was just using the Digication platform. She really did not care for it and kind of pushed back against that, and you can see that in that first project of there's no real design implemented into it. But by the end, as she took the time to learn how to use it, she realized, along with her genre awareness, that she could combine both of those things to make a product that would be better received by her intended audience. And then for Min, he did a really good job of designing his projects to show, without exactly telling, that he understood the difference between things like academic and popular sources. So you can see he created image galleries to show the difference between an academic journal article versus a news headline, and reflects that he had learned that through the course. He also had a pretty strong meta-awareness of his rhetorical decisions. And similarly to Jamila, as a business major, he made a transition from a more formal business report into a financial journalist news article, one you might see on like CNN. And so in this space, he's reflecting upon how he's going to need to make design choices that, one, are different just to adhere to the conventions of that genre, but also to make it more interesting to his readers, recognizing that he was moving from a specialist audience to a much broader audience and trying to think through the ramifications of that decision. And then in the third section, he talks about the different technologies he was trying out, how he was remixing them and blending them together to create the most effective product in the end. Collaboration was also really important to all three participants. For Min, in his effort to learn more about design, he was always working with other students, looking at their Digication pages, troubleshooting the technology with each other to make really, really cool and effective Digication pages. He compares in this reflection a different technology that he had worked with and describes the affordances and constraints, and then reconciles those things with the content knowledge and the research ambitions that he had, and figuring out how these different technologies would be best used to explain what his research agenda was. For Amira, she found some really strong friends that became literacy sponsors in the class. From her classmates, she learned a lot of language knowledge and also cultural knowledge. And these things were really important to Amira as she would workshop with these students and figure out what her identity was alongside and in conversation with these other students, and how those students had different cultural and language backgrounds, they had different research agendas, but they were all working together to create effective written products. And then for Jamila, she actually extended her literacy circle, her literacy sponsors, beyond the realm of the class. She routinely would work with friends who were outside of our class. And so she was making really wonderful connections between what she was doing in the one course with how it related to other people and other things she was doing in her life. So her notion of literacy and academic literacy and its usefulness really expanded beyond the classroom. And coinciding with this, all three students reflected on their social location in one way or another. For Jamila, as a business major, she was really excited to go into industry, but realized that a lot of big businesses have really negative impacts on the environment. And Jamila really cared about the environment. And so she was constantly reconciling if this was something she even wanted to go into, if she did go into it, to what extent would she need to kind of calibrate herself, norm herself with the dominant discourse community in order to be able to enact change? Would she not make those changes and just go with her agenda of wanting to make big industry better for the environment? And so this was a reflective process that she was constantly engaging in and debating. And you can see that in her final project, where she parses out how fast fashion was negatively impacting the environment. And then for Amira, she demonstrated her desire for safe community, which clearly stemmed from her lack of safe community due to the war in Syria. And she paired that with her research interest of public and community health to, in the situation of the coronavirus, figure out how to educate people in her community to make it a safer space health-wise for people to live in. And this personal desire that she had for safety was really effectively demonstrated through her rhetorical appeals, especially in that final infographic that she created. And then for Min, he was constantly aware of his identities, first of being Vietnamese and researching China and Chinese international business policies. And then he was aware of the fact that he wasn't only Vietnamese, but he was also Asian. And then he was aware that he was Vietnamese and Asian and in the United States. And so that added an entire other layer of the way he was perceived, the way he perceived himself, and the way he could or could not interact with his research topic of Chinese international policy. All three students really expanded their ideas of literacy. For Amira, this was the final project. It was a portfolio. And she recognized that her literacy was not a just in the moment thing, that it really crossed times and spaces and places. And so you can see she recognized Starbucks pre-pandemic, before we were all sent home, as being a really useful space for her. And not having that to go do her writing was really tricky when she was then living at home. She mentioned her support system of her sister as that being really useful for her literate identity development. And then also her literacy was helped through the academic community writ large, through things like the university website, but then also her personal academic literacy development through her Digication page. Jamila also reflected on similar things through her portfolio, and you can see again the friends outside of class that were important to her. And then also in her ongoing battle to use different technologies, she recognizes that Google Drive was in the end helpful for her, and she learned how to use it. And she mentioned that it ended up being right next to Netflix in her website browser's suggestion of websites to visit. So I appreciated her ongoing efforts to be participating in the class, to be working and researching and designing. And that ultimately really positively affected her literacy. And then for Min, his portfolio was much more focused on academic literacies specifically, so we didn't see the type of development that we did in Amira and Jamila's, but he did clearly recognize that his literacies, although personal to him, like his identity of being Vietnamese, were going to be publicly demonstrated. And so you can see at the top, he welcomes people to his homepage. He knows that people are going to be reading this. He has a picture of himself so they know what he looks like. He gives a little bit of personal background to make it more interactive, and then has clearly designed the entire site to make it easy to navigate so outside readers can engage with his content. Overall, we see that all three of these students took up their Digication pages in very different ways through very different research projects. But this sense of diversity affirms what Diane Belcher says about creating and communicating meaning, and how that can be really enhanced through a large semiotic toolkit, which can be developed through digital literacy practices and being involved in digital spaces. And so because these students had diverse pages and diverse experiences, came from very diverse backgrounds, they all had very different user experiences. And you can see that kind of undergirding the conveyor belt on this slide. But in spite of those different experiences, these 4 areas of growth that I've listed, they all had those areas of growth. They experienced them, they processed them in very different ways. They meant things to each student differently, but they were all able to grow in their sense of literacy, their sense of writing, and their sense of identity, both personally and professionally as an emerging scholar and emerging professional in their various discourse communities. So although in this case study we've seen that digital spaces can facilitate productive identity work, one thing that Brooke Schreiber tells us is that digital spaces, particularly in a space where there is a large presence of the white, English-speaking dominant discourse, that digital spaces can kind of be co-opted into that and become a reification of that singular culture. But if we facilitate these productively and with care and compassion, that these can be productive spaces for all students in the class. And we see that here as the collaboration was really important to all 3 of these students, and it worked both ways. It wasn't just one student pouring into another, but there was cross-investment between all of the students. And in order to make sure that that's a process that can happen routinely, and UX researchers say that there must be a continuous critical analysis of race, culture, and socio-political contexts in interface design. If we want digital spaces to be safe spaces, they have to be analyzed spaces, and spaces of which we're constantly aware and practicing safe practices, inclusive practices, which leads to my recommendations of being inclusive of all kinds of identities that enter into the classroom, not just the cultural or linguistic identities we've discussed today, but disabilities, different kinds of learning styles, and supporting those, not just as the instructor to students, but across student to student, because those relationships can be very meaningful. And then the bottom 2 recommendations are advocating for time and space to create, to experiment, to design, to try and fail, so that students can see what semiotic toolkit that they have, what they can develop. And then the investment of using a singular technology, over time, they can see that longitudinal development, particularly in the case of Amira and Jamila, who had very reserved digital practices in the first project compared to what they were able to create by the 3rd and then the final portfolio project. That can become a really meaningful document for students to be proud of, to reflect back on, and all the things they've accomplished. And in the case of men, it can be an outward-facing document that can be used to demonstrate to others what these students are capable of, what they believe in, and who they want to become, and who they are currently. So, in conclusion, I affirm that digital spaces can, in fact, be developmental and restorative literacy spaces, so long as we create a community of care that's centered around sponsoring one another's literacy development in an inclusive, equitable manner. And I hope that Amira, Jamila, and Min's stories today, which thank you to those participants, demonstrate that to you as a digital space, regardless of whether it's education or not, can be a really positive space for literate identity development work. So thank you so much for dropping into this presentation. Here's my contact information. If you have questions or comments, I would love to speak with you, so feel free to drop me an email or stop by my website. If you're interested, the references are the final 2 slides in this presentation, so feel free to link out and you can look through those and engage with this scholarship on your own. Thank you so much and have a great day.